Hello, dears. This is Annette of AnnetteLeonard.com. Welcome back. I am continuing my interview with Lise Snyderman. So, you've written this book, Lights in the Darkness. Can you tell us some about that?
Yeah, it's called A Light in the Darkness,
Mhm.
Transcending Chronic Illness Through the Power of Art and Attitude.
Mhm.
So the genesis of this is in 2016. I acknowledged or understood that I really hadn't processed my illness. I had done lots of things on the creative side to express, but I was starting to feel a yearning to be part of something bigger. And expressing and my healing path, it didn't seem to be enough at that point. I also was, at some points of the roller coaster, I was feeling better at times and, having harder days. I mean, it's hard, obviously, when you're chronically ill, you always are at a baseline. But there are times, when I'm up on the up of the roller coaster. And at that point, I was feeling that I want to give back in whatever way that looks like. So for me, giving back meant I need to share my story. And to do that, I want to write. I want to share my confessions and my impressions and my worldview and my life lessons and help and inspire and support others who are going through chronic illness. So that was the genesis of why I wanted to write my book. And so what I discovered through that process is that the creative side I talked about, but there's also the side of what I'm calling attitude. It isn't just, and I'm not going to be Pollyanna Anna-ish about this. I'm not just going to say, oh, just be rosy and be positive and everything's okay. I think what it is just acknowledging that you need support systems and that you can't go it alone and that you are going to feel what you feel, and all of these things are all true at the same time. And so attitude has been really big to me about when, especially at my lowest points in the disease. Here's an example, right? When you talk about a partnership or support, I've had an incredible pillar and a rock of a husband I've been so blessed and fortunate, to go along this path with me on this journey. And the example is, it's about how I show up. If I'm in a place of gratitude and love and appreciation, that person is going to also want to be able to do what they can and help. And as opposed to me being expectant or feeling like a victim or playing the victim or in despair. I'm not saying we don't have the right to our feelings and that we can't feel those, but I am saying that if we dwell there, it's going to impact not only us, but also those around us.
Hmm.
Yeah.
I think that's true, and you're right that doesn't mean I spiritually bypass all of those negative emotions. And I was just on a podcast the other day talking about the fact that for myself, and I think we all have to find these tolerances, I have a 3-day pity party limit that just is what works for me, that I can only sort of wallow and like eat the pint of Ben and Jerry's and sit in front of shitty reality television for about 3 days. And that's my limit, when I get bad news, when I get whatever it is, then it's sort of like, okay. And then it's carry water, chop wood, like get about the business of daily living again. That it doesn't work for me to sit in despair.
I understand. And I think, like you said, everybody has to set what works for them. But, I think that we are not our diseases. And I think that
Amen.
that's really important no matter what. We all have bad days and bad weeks, bad months. I get it. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think it's interesting, and that your path is not unlike many people's path around chronic illness, that first there is this radical inward focus where the world falls away, and there is this incredible reckoning that comes with what is this new reality, the incredible grief, the redefining of self, the struggle with identity around who am I if I am not these things that I used to define myself by. And then this, how do I give back? How do I show up in the world? How do I use my gifts for change or to support others and lift them up too, and find ways to not be in this alone, or to help others not feel so alone in it also. And
I'll say one thing though.
yeah,
For
please
me,
do.
number one, it's not linear, just like all of us.
Mm-hmm.
Number
Mm-hmm.
two, I forgot to grieve.
Mm-hmm.
So the other missing piece for me is grief.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, I went from diagnosis and transformation physically to management. I didn't do the processing of all of these stages. And so as a result, I'm actually working on a project right now, a musical project that is called The Grieving Project. And it is a spoken word album creating from the stages of grief and
Mm-hmm.
inventing my own stages of thriving.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm using, my own spoken word and music behind it, and then other characters to play out the grief that I really didn't go through. And I think the acknowledging that, even when we haven't talked about the summit yet, but in my interview process, not one of these people talked about grief as a strategy in 60 speakers.
Wow.
So interesting that we all, so, that's something that I think was missed. The other piece I'll say is I also didn't go like linearly, as I'm saying. I feel like I spent a lot of time immersed in creativity to forget the darkness. In other words, I was hiding in some ways behind my artist identity by escaping, by going into fantasy and creating music and musicals and my whole art world. I didn't have to face the darkness. So in some ways, I created art that was so separate from the illness, like a fantasy musical. Until I realized more recently that my themes in the musical were light and dark. And not even understanding that I was actually playing out when I was creating the struggle that I was having with light and dark. I didn't even know, and I'm glad in some ways, because it would have colored that experience in a different way. But that acknowledgement that now the art that I'm making is more centered on, I can use the gifts in the illness and put that into the art. That's what the summit, for example, for me, it's still creating. It doesn't have to just be a spoken word album or a musical, or it can be these different forms like films.
Fascinating. Let's talk about the summit in just a moment, but I want to pause on this for a second. I am really stalled out and amazed by the fact that you're saying that you have talked to so many people and this theme of grief never arose. What do you make of that?
I think partly it's in the questioning and in the directions that I'm steering people. I'm going to take my own, responsibility for how I steer an interview. But I think it's interesting that most people bypass what I think it means is that we don't think of the importance of grief as a strategy. It's not that we don't do it. It's that we're not saying, here, we need to grieve.
Yeah.
That's what I take it as. And I think that acknowledging that, and understanding that that's also a valid strategy is important. Not just turn to creativity, or meditate or yoga, or let's think about our diet, nutrition, or mindfulness and all these things. That's sort of my wheelhouse that I think of. What are the things that help us thrive?
Yeah.
I didn't think about grief. Yeah.
So in the last 2 years, I've lost my mom and my brother quite suddenly. And so grief has been on my mind pretty poignantly. And I find that we are so uncomfortable and unfamiliar with how to manage grief in our culture, that's what arises for me too, is just our discomfort with grief, our lack of skill, our lack of
we don't want to be in this place. It's not a, you know what I mean? For myself, I don't want to dwell in sadness and hardship and difficulty and blah, blah, blah. Like, that's why I turned, to my fantasy. I know that part of me, that's what it is. The other thing I'll mention is that grief is something that is, let me think, because you had just said something that sparked something for me that, oh, go ahead. I honestly, I'll come back to it, but it was poignant.
Let's pause for a moment and
yes.
see if it comes to you.
Okay. Oh, yes, it did. Chronic illness. In other words, people don't necessarily grieve illness. They grieve the loss of loved ones and the loss, for example, perhaps now in their life of their work. You know what I mean? It's like they've lost work. They've lost
social opportunities.
Social opportunity. But illness, it isn't always something somebody turns to think, I need to grieve illness. Yeah.
Agreed. Thanks for joining us, and tune in tomorrow for the conclusion of my interview with Lise Snyderman. Till we're together again, I thank you for your time and attention. Please don't forget to subscribe, leave a comment or a question, and until we're together again, be well.